Thank you, Kevin, and good evening, everybody. Welcome, and to all of the viewers later on YouTube. As Kevin said, I'm talking tonight on the subject, the sacrifice of Isaac, which is from one of the very earliest chapters in the Bible. It's a very, very ancient story, and I'm wanting to consider it in detail with you tonight. To me, it's a very significant story. I think it has been for centuries to the Jewish faith, to the Christian faith, and even in the Islamic faith. Although the Muslims do change the story, as they do with most things. It's based on the Bible story, but they make it about Ishmael rather than Isaac. But nonetheless, the story is important to them too. My first slide up here on the left shows a very famous classical painting depicting the sacrifice of Isaac. We can see the character of Abraham here, and he's just dropping a knife here which he was about to use to slay his son Isaac, who is bound here, and the angel intervenes at the last moment to prevent Abraham sacrificing Isaac. This painting was done about 400 years ago. It's one of a good many classical paintings of this very dramatic scene, this very important subject. And as Kevin's outlined in the introduction, many people, this is a fair representation of the critical point in the story, but many people see that and regard it as something barbaric, something primitive, so different from the modern world, which is supposedly past all these things, and should be, in their view, discounted, and that the religion of the Bible is no better than other pagan religions, and so we shouldn't consider it further. I have a very different view of this. I think it is quite an incredible incident and an amazing chapter, the way that it is written, and that, as the Bible itself brings out, it has some very important things to teach us and to foreshadow about what God has done through Christ. So what I'm wanting to do tonight is, first of all, the text is not that long. It's 19 verses from Genesis 22. I want to actually read the whole text. I'm doing that because I'm going to refer in detail to what the text says and to bring out of it certain features of the story. But before I do that, I just want to give a little bit of the background of this story. I want to consider its date, the text itself, the origin of the text, and the background of the text, and the background of the story itself. After we've considered the story in Genesis 22, I then want to talk about human sacrifice more generally, what the Bible has to say on this subject, and then to progress on to animal sacrifices, which the Bible has a great deal to say about. I then want to consider the New Testament view of these things and to see the link with Jesus before I wrap it up with the significance of this subject. So let's begin then with the text. Now, you may not be able to read it there, the print may be too small, but if you do look at this on YouTube later, and for any of our viewers later too, the whole text is here. And I want to just read it. I'm reading from the New International Version, and let me just read the text to you. Sometime later, we'll look at what it's later to, but sometime later God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it has said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba. It's not quite the end of the chapter, but it's definitely the end of that story, 19 verses in all. Now, this is an extremely ancient story. It's in the first book of the 66 books of the Bible in the 22nd chapter. And the story is about Abraham. Now, according to the Bible's own chronology, Abraham lived about 4,000 years ago, give or take a bit. That's around 2000 BC. And this story is contained in Genesis, which is the first of the 5 books of the Bible attributed to Moses. Moses himself lived, again according to Bible chronology, roughly about 1500 BC. That there's a little bit of variation in when that was, but roughly 1500 BC. But in the book of Genesis, although the 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy, are attributed to Moses, he's regarded as the author. In New Testament times, he was regarded as the author, and before that. Yet it's clear in the book of Genesis that it's actually a compilation of earlier records still. There is a word in there, a Hebrew word called Toledoth, which occurs 10 times through Genesis to mark out individual sections. And that word is translated, "This is the book of the generation of," in one of the versions. If I look in Genesis chapter 11, verse 27, for example, here, what I've done on these slides, by the way, at the bottom I've written out in full the relevant Bible quotations. I haven't got every quotation there, but the significant ones are there, and others are referred to in the text up above, can be looked up at your leisure. But let's look at Genesis 11 verse 27. That's the beginning of the whole series of stories about Abraham, and it begins with the words, "This is the account of." And it's that expression that's based on the Hebrew word Toledoth, which occurs 10 times through Genesis. And so it would seem that each of these blocks in Genesis is actually earlier records that have been compiled together to cover everything from the creation of the earth and in the time of Adam and Eve through to the story of Joseph at the end of the book of Genesis. And the sequence about Abraham is in the middle of all that. So it goes from Genesis 11 verse 27 through to 25 verse 11, and 25 verse 12 begins the next section. Okay, so the book of Genesis is very old when it was compiled by Moses, but the record of this time of Abraham is even earlier than that. So we're talking about something extremely ancient. Now, that's the background to the text itself, and that it is a very ancient story. But now let's talk about the background to the story itself, this story of the sacrifice of Isaac. Isaac, the son of Abraham and Sarah, he was born in the old age of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham was 100 years old, according to the story, when his son Isaac was born. Now, obviously, the ages of those patriarchs is greater than the ages that we're used to today. Abraham lived considerably longer than that, but at 100 years old, he was very old. And Sarah, his wife, it is recorded that she was barren. Genesis 11 verse 30 here says that now Sarai, her name before it was changed to Sarah, Sarai was barren. She had no children. And she was also, by that stage, very old. She was 90 years old. And as Genesis 18 verse 11 says, Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing, besides the fact that she was barren. And Isaac was promised in these circumstances by God that they would have this child, and that this child would be a great blessing to them. It was much anticipated. And then God also gave great and wonderful promises concerning this child. He'd already given great promises to Abraham, which are extremely significant in the Bible record right through. But these promises were also going to be focused through his son Isaac, so that just before I go on to that, Genesis 17 verse 17, when the child is promised to Abraham, Abraham said, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And that's exactly what happened by God's miraculous intervention. But this child was also this subject of promises, as Genesis 17 verse 21 points out, amongst other passages. God said, I will establish my covenant with Isaac as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. So that all the things that he'd promised Abraham about how he would bless Abraham and bless his descendants and bless the world through Abraham's descendants, he promised too about this baby Isaac, that it would all come not just through Abraham but through Isaac and through Isaac's descendants. So that's the background to the story itself. It gives the setting for this sacrifice. Actually, when we talk about the sacrifice of Isaac, the Jewish people call this the binding of Isaac, because he wasn't actually sacrificed. God called him initially to be sacrificed, but he was only bound, and the Hebrew word for that is akadah. It's a very particular word that's used for binding an animal sacrifice on an altar, and that's what happened to Isaac in the story. Anyway, I think, hopefully it came out in my reading of it, but the quality of the storytelling is really superb. Given that this is such an ancient story, and we're inclined to think of the very, very ancient stories as being simple stories, this is actually beautifully put together and very dramatic in its form. And I just want to point out some of the features of this story. Abraham and Isaac are obviously the two central characters in the story, and our focus is directed to them by the continual use of Abraham. He's named 16 times throughout this story, so we're always directed to Abraham. But likewise, Isaac, though he only speaks once in the story, he is mentioned 19 times in this section, 6 by name, 3 by the only one, the only son of Abraham that is, and 10 by son. And you get, right at the very beginning, it says, God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, there's a great beauty in the way that is focused on Isaac, but the repetition of these equivalent phrases brings out the significance of Isaac to Abraham. There's an intimate, loving and cooperative relationship between Abraham and Isaac, which is very beautifully brought out in the chapter, not only by that verse which I just read, but also by the way that Isaac speaks to his father. He looks up, he spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. That's in verse 7. And then in verse 6, the end of verse 6, you've got a repetition of this expression here. The two of them went on together. So you can see the bonds between those two. And then that is repeated later on in the end of verse 8. It says once again, the same expression, the two of them went on together. It's emphasising the unity of the Father and the Son in what is being done. Now I want to just mention about the meaning of this word boy. It's translated as boy in the NIV that I read twice in verses 5 and 12. Jewish traditions that go back a very, very long way make Isaac out to be not what we would call a boy. Josephus, who lived about the time of Christ, he was a great literary person and historian. He wrote down all the Jewish traditions of the time, which are very largely what's in the Bible, but other things as well. And he says that Isaac at this point was 25 years old. There's an earlier Jewish tradition that's quite valued, 100 to 200 years before the time of Christ. It says he was 23. And there's another one a few hundred years later that says he was 37. The reason 37 is mentioned is that it's based on what comes, the very next incident is the death of Sarah. In 23 verse 1 it says that Sarah lived to be 127 years old and she died. So that if that incident followed immediately after what was in chapter 22, then Isaac would be 37, but that's pretty unlikely. However, we do get a picture from this that Isaac was quite a mature man, more than a teenager even. Also, the particular Hebrew word that's used for boy in those two verses is the very same word that's used for servant or servants in verses 3, 5 and 19. So the servants that went along with Abraham, they are also the same expression for them. So it's likely not to have been a 10-year-old or an 8-year-old, but much more likely to be a 20-year-old or 20 years old plus. So whatever, it's obvious then that Isaac's willing participation in this is implied. Abraham's very old and Isaac's a mature man with the man's strength. So Isaac could easily have overpowered his father if he had wanted to and resisted being bound in the way that he was. He could have run away, but he didn't. So even though it's not said there, you can get the implication that Isaac is fully a part of what, he's passive, but he's fully a part of what is happening here. It's not just Abraham doing something to his son Isaac. Okay, now the other really significant thing that comes through this whole chapter is Abraham's very ready obedience and his trust in God without question. God gives this instruction to Abraham at the beginning. Early the next morning, we're not told exactly how this came to him, whether it was by a dream or some other revelation, but it does say that early the next morning Abraham got up and went about it. There's no statement about Abraham questioning God as to whether he got this message right or anything. He just hears the word of God and he acts on it. The word that's used here too in several places is here I am, and that is typically used elsewhere in the Bible of the ready response of a servant to his master. Like, for example, Isaiah, when God comes to the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah says, here I am, do with me according whatever you want, Lord, I'm your servant. And this is Abraham's response to God when God speaks to him. Abraham, here I am, he replied. And then once again, when he's called, when the angel of God calls to him to prevent the sacrifice finally going ahead, he calls Abraham, Abraham, to get his attention. Here I am, Abraham replies. The very same expression that's repeated in the chapter. But there's actually a third place in the chapter which is lost in the NIV, but in the Hebrew, it's the very same words right in the middle of that when Isaac looks up to his father Abraham and says, Father? And Abraham says, yes, my son. That is actually, here I am. It's the very same expression a third time in the middle of that. So, and Abraham himself cuts the wood. He doesn't give that task to the servants. He gets about that and does it, and they set off for this 3-day journey to the mountains, the region of Moriah. Now, I think I've covered everything there that I intended to. 7:5. And Abraham's faith is seen too. He says to the servants, wait here, we're going to go and worship. It's a general word. He's not saying specifically that he's going to go away there and sacrifice Isaac. He and Isaac are going away from the servants and the donkey to worship God, and we will return, he said. So Abraham's got confidence stated there that somehow Isaac is going to be spared or he's going to be resurrected, and that they will together come back. He trusted in God because God had given these promises through his son Isaac. Now, another interesting feature of the story that shows the quality of the storytelling is how the action slows down through this. At the beginning, Abraham responds very quickly, and in a couple of verses, we've covered 3 days' journey. He sets off on this, and then he looks up and sees the place in the distance where they're to go. And then as you progressively get to that climax, so the action slows down until at the very end, every little action is described. He prepares the altar, he lays the wood, he gets his son Isaac, he binds Isaac, lays Isaac on the altar, he lifts his hand, he takes the knife, he lifts his hand, and then the angel stops him. So the action really slows down, and it's a very dramatic presentation of this story, done in a beautiful literary way that's noteworthy. There's key terms that are used throughout the story. Burnt offering 6 times. The word see is very significant because it's actually the same word for see and provide. So when Abraham says later that God will provide, it says how he saw the place in the distance, and then later on he saw the ram caught in the thicket. It's the same word that's used for provide. In the mountain, that God will provide the lamb for the offering. And he called this place, the Lord will provide. That's the meaning of the name Jehovah Jireh, the place, the name that Abraham gave this place. And in the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. Now we have a kind of a sense in English of the word see. We can say, see to it about something, and that sort of gives the connection between this providing and seeing. In the Hebrew, it's the same thing. So this term is used repeatedly throughout the chapter. There's also another interesting literary feature of this, that right at the very beginning, God said in verse 2, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there. And these same 3 words are used towards the end of the chapter when it says in verse 13, Abraham, after the angel had stopped him, Abraham went over and took the ram and sacrificed it. There's actually the same 3 Hebrew words there at the beginning and the end of the story. One other thing, looked up. Looked up is an evocative expression. It says in verse 4, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance where they were to go. And then after the sacrifice of Isaac, the intended sacrifice of Isaac, he looked up and saw the ram. So there's something significant that's brought out elsewhere in the Bible too about looking up. Okay. Anyway, in my view and the view of others, it's a very beautifully told story. Now look, at this point, I should have mentioned this before, but I want to acknowledge 3 books that I've used on this in researching this that I have found valuable. First of all, there's this commentary in Understanding the Bible commentary series by John Hartley on Genesis. I found that very helpful. And secondly, an older commentary, Genesis, an introduction and commentary by Derek Kidner. And then thirdly, this one here. This is not quite like a commentary on the whole book, but it's Fathers of the Covenant by H.L. Allison, Studies in Genesis and Exodus. I found those 3 quite helpful in bringing out features of this chapter and its significance, and I have relied to a large extent on the material there. Now, the region of Moriah was mentioned. Moriah's, nobody knows exactly where it is, but it's only referred to once elsewhere in the Old Testament, and that is in 2nd of Chronicles chapter 3 in the history of all the kings of much later, and there it's identified with the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which is today where the Dome of the Rock is, around there. Now, it's actually, Abraham was told to go to the region of Moriah, so it seems that it was probably somewhere where Jerusalem is today, maybe where Jesus was crucified. You could make that identification. It would seem very appropriate, but whether or not it's the actual place, the correspondence is really in what the story is telling us more than the significance of the place. But nonetheless, it did say that Abraham walked with a donkey and the servants and his son Isaac 3 days, and then they saw the region of Moriah. And he was at that time in Beersheba, as we learned from these references here. Beersheba's down in the south, and it would be about 3 days' walk to get up to the region of Jerusalem. So that's very feasible that Moriah is there in Jerusalem. It's interesting that in chapter 22, when Abraham names the place, and he names it Jehovah-Jireh, or in the NIV translation, the Lord will provide, which is what Jehovah-Jireh means. It's written here, and to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. So this place, the region of Moriah, and where the sacrifice took place, is known as the mountain of the Lord. So it very well could be what later became Jerusalem. Now, I want to just comment too on the use of the word tested. It says at the beginning, God tested Abraham. Older versions, like the King James Version, say tempted Abraham. And back when the King James Version was translated, tempted meant the same as tested. It's actually changed its meaning to mean something different these days. So the sense is that God is testing Abraham in this, or proving Abraham. Proving is perhaps a better way to understand that word. And then it says later on, the angel said, now I know that you fear God, because you were prepared to give the thing that you most loved, your son Isaac, and not to withhold him from me. I know that you love me. Now, of course, God knows everything. He knows everything he knows the end from the beginning. He knows the hearts of every one of us better than we know ourselves. He didn't need to do anything to know what was in Abraham's heart and mind. So he didn't need to probe Abraham to find out. But we need this, and others need this. So it's not for God's benefit, it was for Abraham's own benefit that the testing or proving took place, and so that others, including the principalities and powers, just as in the case of Job, they would know that he was a man who actually loved God and obeyed and honoured God. So it's really, this testing is really for Abraham's benefit. And furthermore, in this testing or proving, there's a development of character. It's not until we're actually put in a testing situation that we prove even to ourselves that we actually do truly believe something. It's one thing to believe something academically, it's another thing to be put in a practical situation where that belief or faith or trust is tested and proved. And so I think we have to understand the use of these words in that way. Okay? Now, human sacrifice. Some people think that this story of Isaac, terrible story because it's all about human sacrifice, and the idea of human sacrifice is appalling, and they think, well, this is the Bible contains this sort of thing. Let's skip it. I want to just consider what else the Bible says about human sacrifice. Human sacrifice was practiced by nations surrounding Israel, in particular the Phoenician area, which is around modern-day Lebanon, up that way. It seems it was also practiced to a limited degree by the Canaanitish tribes, who were in the same general area as Israel as well. The point is made repeatedly in the Bible, in the Law of Moses, in Deuteronomy, these passages here I've written down, and Leviticus as well, that God absolutely detests human sacrifice that was practiced by these nations. And it was for that reason, amongst other things, that God dispossessed those other nations. It was because of the degraded way their whole society had performed, in particular seen by human sacrifices amongst it. That was one of the reasons amongst many, and they're part of their idolatrous worship, that God judged them and dispossessed them and replaced them by Israel. Now, I've written one quote down the bottom there. This is from Deuteronomy 12 as an example. You, Israel, this is an instruction from God in the law through Moses. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, that is the way of the nations, because in worshipping their gods they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods. Now the next quotation I've listed there is a longer bit, but to the same effect. And so it's quite clear that the Bible view from the beginning right through is that God detests people sacrificing others and their children in this way. There was occasionally apostasy in Israel that was severely condemned by God and judged by God, with one or two of the kings who were particularly evil at that time, like Ahaz and Manasseh, and the end of the kingdom of Israel in particular, when things like that happened. And if you look up these quotations here, you'll see the same kind of thing expressed, that Israel, at least at those times, under those kings, had become no better than the nations that were dispossessed, and God would severely punish them for it, resulting in the exile of the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel. So once again, God's view of these things, extremely negative view of these things, comes out through those texts. It's interesting that sometimes you find a marginal alternative to the words sacrificed in the fire, sacrificed their sons or their daughters in the fire. There's a marginal alternative, passed through the fire. And it's a little bit, I haven't really fully researched this, as to whether the child, there's some kind of idolatrous worship and some kind of fire involved, and the child or the baby was passed through the fire. And you might wonder, well, did the baby or child survive or not? And it seems in some cases they definitely didn't. So that's interesting, that alternative view. But nonetheless, there definitely were human sacrifices. There is one other case in the Bible, Jephthah's daughter, which is recorded in Judges 11, which Jephthah made this very rash promise that if God would deliver Israel, who were being greatly oppressed at that time, through him, he would sacrifice whatever came out of the door of his house, thinking it would be a goat or something wandering in and out of the house, that he would sacrifice. And it was his daughter, his only child, who came out full of joy to greet her father, but he'd made this promise. And it does, the way the text is written, it seems like she was sacrificed, but she may not have been. It may be that she became a perpetual virgin, like a nun. But even if she was sacrificed, certainly you can see how it goes against the tenor of everything else that's written in the Old Testament. And it really illustrates the main point of Judges, which is that there was no king in Israel, then everybody did whatever they thought was right in their own eyes. And there's many appalling stories in the book of Judges illustrating how astray the people were from God, and how mixed things were. So even if there was a sacrifice of a human being there, which would be utterly appalling, it certainly is not condoned. Okay. As a chapter, one of the prophets, Micah, which we'll come to a little later, implies also the unacceptability of human sacrifice, that God just would never accept human sacrifice as being meaningful in any way to himself. Now, it is interesting that there are other cultures outside the biblical world where human sacrifice took place. I've already mentioned the Phoenicians and the Canaanites, who were in the biblical surroundings. But there's also been the Aztecs in America that were over hundreds of years. They sacrificed humans. The Celtic Druids also, there's human sacrifice associated there. Vikings, and one that's more interesting to and closer to the modern age is Hinduism. Maybe not so well known, but embedded into Hinduism for long time, there was human sacrifice. I understand typically of a young female, but there was the sacrifice. When the English in particular came to rule in India, they were appalled at these things, and very quickly, though they allowed many other things of Hinduism to continue, and took a benign view of a lot of other things, they were appalled at this and quickly prevented that from continuing. But it is actually a part of traditional ancient Hindu worship. It actually sort of shows where the Hinduism came from, because you can tie it in with the things that we read of these other surrounding nations in biblical times. And also, along with that, there's what's called sati, widow burning, which was carried out a lot more in India until much more recent times, wherein when a man died, they typically would burn the dead body on a pile of wood. That was how they, rather than burial, that's what they did. But that's fine for the dead man. But very often his live widow was burnt along with him. They thought that that's part of their culture. So again, that the British and others took an extremely dim view of that, and it has become illegal in India, but it's actually part of Hinduism and the Hindu culture to do that sort of thing. Allied with that, look, I won't go into it, but there's the role of widows in India is very, very low, and reflects that they're very, very they can be destitute, they can be, they're very badly treated, they're disregarded. Nobody wants the widow to care for them, even within families. It's very distressing what happens to widows in India, and that's an outcome of the Hindu culture and of long standing, of centuries of that tradition. And I'm not saying that old people have it easy in any society, but those countries that have had a Christian heritage of some sort, of the Judeo-Christian heritage, have a very different regard for their old people and caring for the old widows, as we would like to see. But anyway, all those things tie together. They're all actually related to the human sacrifice, in my view. Now, the other thing too about human sacrifice recorded in the Bible is that when you come to consider Isaac, the subject I've had tonight, the sacrifice of Isaac, is actually a misnomer because he wasn't sacrificed. God called Abraham initially to sacrifice his son, and Abraham was prepared to do so right up to the very point, but God prevented it from happening, so he wasn't finally sacrificed, and it stands as a unique incident in the Bible. Okay? Now, on the other hand, animal sacrifices, this is worthy of a whole subject itself, but I want to just mention some things about animal sacrifices. You cannot read the Old Testament and miss animal sacrifices. It's there all the way through. And it's mentioned in this particular story. The sacrifice of animals is very extensive in ancient Israel and throughout the Old Testament. There were sacrifices for individuals, there were national sacrifices. There were other offerings that were not necessarily animals. There were a variety of animals, there was a variety of purposes, but the main thing that animals were sacrificed was for atonement, to obtain forgiveness from God for wrongs that had been committed. And it's acknowledged that everybody's committed wrongs. The nation has, the leaders, and all the people, individually and corporately. So that's the main reason why there are sacrifices. Now, it does occur, the animal sacrifice occurs in this story. Isaac himself has an expectation that, well, there should be a lamb for this sacrifice, and it's not there. So, you know, it's embedded in the story. And then later, the ram that was caught in the thicket, that is sacrificed. So we can see it in that story. But it doesn't begin there. The Bible account has sacrifices long before that, right back to the very beginning. Abel, the son of Adam and Eve, offered an animal sacrifice that was acceptable to God. His brother Cain, who murdered Abel, made an offering too, and his offering was not accepted, and it's probably not because it wasn't an animal offering. He offered grain and things of the field, and we know from later that those kind of offerings were acceptable in certain circumstances, thanksgivings and so on. It would seem that it was a matter of the heart, that Abel's heart was different in it than Cain's was, and that this is what God approved and disapproved in the two. But nonetheless, my point I'm trying to make is that Abel did offer an animal sacrifice right back at the very beginning, soon after the beginning of creation. And it's implied even earlier than that, because it tells us how God provided skins, animal skins, to cover the nakedness of Adam and Eve after they had sinned and they were ashamed before God and ashamed of their nakedness, which they hadn't been earlier. And they'd tried, sewed these fig leaves together, aprons of fig leaves, but God provided them skins of animals. So animal sacrifice is implied there in dealing with the consequences of their sin, even though it's not spelled out specifically. And then, of course, there's sacrifices in Noah's time. So that the whole idea of sacrifices, which is dealt with extensively in the law of Moses after Genesis, in Exodus, Leviticus and so on, there's chapters and chapters telling you what animals you should sacrifice, how you should go about it, what the ritual is, how often you should do it, where it should be done, etc., how the animal should be bled and so on. All these things are spelled out. But it didn't originate in the law of Moses. It would seem that it's codified in the law of Moses and systematised, but it didn't originate there. It goes way, way, way back before the time of Moses, back to the almost to the beginning of creation. Similarly, the distinction between clean and unclean animals, which is spelt out very clearly in the law of Moses, you can eat lamb and goat, but you can't eat dog. You can't eat a lion, the flesh of a lion. You can eat fish that have scales and fins, but you can't eat octopus or prawns, things like this. The distinction between what's clean and what's unclean is spelled out so fully in the law of Moses. Even that, it didn't begin in the law of Moses. That goes way, way back to the time, first of all, to Noah's time. Okay? As I've said, animal sacrifices were for a variety of situations, but atonement for sin and guilt in order to receive forgiveness was very significant. That's pervasive throughout the whole of the Old Testament. Now, the Old Testament itself gives you indications, despite the fact that there's so much about sacrifice in it, it does give indications that there's something inadequate about it. It has to be repeated over and over and over again, but also it's not exactly what God wants. And there's all these passages here which I've listed. I'll only refer to one of them. That's this Psalm 40 verse 6. It says there, talking to God in this meditation, this psalm, the writer says, this is writing with the Spirit of God, he says, "Sacrifice and offering you, God, did not desire. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not require." And another passage says, does the Lord really want burnt offerings and sacrifice? What he wants is your obedience, your trust in him, your submission to him, not just going through some rituals. So there's enough passages to show that there's something insufficient even about this extensive sacrifice system. It was repeated endlessly, but it did point to something very important. And the whole Jewish system that focused around sacrifices, that goes right back to creation, just after creation, and was regularised in the law of Moses and became part of their national worship for hundreds of years, came to an abrupt end when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70 and the Jews were just dispersed, the remaining Jews were dispersed around the Roman Empire. Jerusalem was destroyed itself, the people there killed, the temple pulled to pieces, and the sacrificial system, which had continued more or less uninterrupted right up to that point, just came to a sudden end and has never been reinstated since. So it served its purpose. Okay, now the New Testament view of these things, both of the story of the sacrifice of Isaac and the whole issue of sacrifice, there's a couple of quotes that I want to refer to, which I've written in full here. Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews, has this to say, reflecting about the incident that we began with, the account of Abraham being called to sacrifice his son. Let me read this to you. It says, "By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, 'It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned.' Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death." So we have there in that statement a recognition of Abraham's obedience to God, his trust in God, and his belief, even though the whole idea of resurrection hadn't been spelled out back then, but he believed that God would just have to save Isaac from this or bring him back from the dead because he'd made these promises that God had to fulfill through Isaac. So Abraham's showing his faith in God, his trust that God would bring everything about to its proper and good end. That's the thinking of the writer to the Hebrews in the New Testament 2,000 years ago. Similarly, the letter of James, chapter 2, verses 21 to 24, it uses this same story that we began with to show how righteous Abraham's faith was proven by testing and how this pleased God. Let me read this quotation too. "Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, 'Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend.' You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone." James' point there is what I said much earlier about a faith which is academic. It's all very well, but when it's tested, it's got to be something that you actually put your faith on the line and it's tested, and that's what happened in Abraham's case, and that demonstrated the validity of his faith, his trust in God, and God was pleased with that. Now, the letter to the Hebrews also says, in relation to this whole issue of sacrifice, it makes the point how the Old Testament's full of animal sacrifices, and the writer to the Hebrews says that the law of Moses, which is the law of God through Moses, it demonstrates that without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. So that I'm not going to explain all this here and now, it's worthy of another subject, but for forgiveness to actually take effect, this is God's view, there must be shedding of blood. That's what that passage says, and that accords with the whole Bible revelation. But on the other hand, Hebrews also says it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats, which were the animals used in these sacrifices, it's impossible for that to actually take away sins. It says that's why they were endlessly repeated, and why the people still always had continuing guilt and never finally did something. It's there to prove a point, but it's never finally getting to the thing. Okay, now finally I want to come to the link of this chapter, Genesis 22, the sacrifice of Isaac, with Jesus. Jesus said on one occasion recorded in the Gospel of John, in his dispute with the religious leaders of the day, he said, "Your father Abraham, he rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad." And although it's not spelled out there, but I really think that Jesus must have had in mind the story of Genesis 22, amongst other things, that there's something in the experience that Abraham went through there that told him about the day of Jesus coming so much later in some kind of enacted prophecy. What we do see in the story, when we think about its correspondence with what God has done through Jesus, and what God has done through Jesus is the central act of history, according to Christian revelation. It's the vital, necessary act of God in history, an act of his love, a supreme act of his love, in order to achieve the redemption of the human race. Okay, now there's a correspondence between what happened there in Jesus and what's happened much earlier back in this story, and that's what I want to just draw out here. In the case of God the Father and his Son, Jesus, we see the complete love and cooperation between the two. Jesus went to the cross, but it was God and Jesus acting harmoniously together. There's no resistance on Jesus' part. There's a willing giving of himself, complete. He had freedom, and he willingly gave himself because it was his delight to do his Father's will. So we see this love and cooperation between the Father and the Son in this sacrifice that Jesus went through. We see the willingness of the Son to die in accordance with the Father's good plan, just as we saw that back in Genesis 22 about Isaac and Abraham. We see the trust of the Son in the Father. He went to his death knowing that, as Jesus said at the end, he said, "Into your hands I commit my spirit," which was apparently the nightly prayer of any devout young Jewish child and adult too. And it's a lovely prayer too, that when I fall unconscious in sleep, I'm actually committing, I can't control anything, I can't know what's going on while I'm unconscious in sleep. In a way, it's like death. My spirit is safe in God's hands. It's worth looking at Psalm 16 in that respect too, because that is a messianic psalm that tells of Jesus knowing that in God's right hand there are pleasures forevermore, the right sort of pleasures forevermore. And that Jesus entrusted himself to God in that, even in going to the cross. And through the cross, there's the resulting exaltation and immense blessing, that all future blessings finally come about because Jesus has gone to the cross. And that's what we saw in germ form back there in Genesis 22, because Abraham was prepared to offer his son Isaac, and Isaac submitted to that. So the angel speaking to Abraham says, you know, he renewed the covenant blessings, but they were extended too. Blessing upon blessing would come to Abraham and through Isaac, because you have obeyed me. So there's a real correspondence between these two events, the lesser back in Genesis 22 and the greater in what God has done through Jesus. Jesus said, "Verily, very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." And that's a simple summary of what Jesus was about producing an immense harvest of rejoicing and to his Father God. And of course, we're told through the words of John the Baptist, recorded in the Gospel of John, Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Although that could not have been achieved by Isaac, we can see an indication of what that's pointing to. That's pointing to what God is actually doing through Jesus. So just in summary, at the end, I want to just say the significance of this story, in my view. The story of the almost sacrifice of Isaac points clearly to the actual sacrifice of Jesus Christ, which is the central act of God in history. And I think it's absolutely amazing that this foreshadowing of this future great event occurs so early in the Bible, in the first few chapters, so early in the history of the human race. It really is quite amazing. And through this incident, Abraham and everybody who would read and believe the Bible account too, Abraham was given an insight into the mind and the heart of God, into the plan of God and into his redeeming love. So that he had indications of this all along in other ways, but it comes to him very wonderfully through this incident. And I want to just say, as I've said on other occasions, but the Bible is absolutely unique. Yeah, sure, you can find correspondences between things that are said in the Bible and even in the religion that's revealed in the Bible, and the things that happened in Egypt and in Canaan and in Phoenicia and Greece and Rome and everything. Yeah, there are correspondences, and there's correspondences in stories, but nonetheless, what we have in the Bible is utterly unique, it is amazing, and it's unified, despite the fact that it goes, this writing covers at least 1,500 years, written over throughout all the books that comprise our Bible, written over 1,500 years, and by a huge variety of human authors, and in different cultural settings and that through that time. There's a remarkable unity in all that, which I think itself is a testimony to the fact that it's the Word of God. Its message is utterly unique and it's stupendous. And I think this, amongst many other things, to me, it tells me, and it should tell us, that we can have confidence in the Bible. It's worth reading, it's worth absorbing, it's worth pondering over and delving into the detail and finding out how one part links with another and everything. We can have confidence in this, and it will do us good, eternal good. So my final plea is, let's read it. Thank you.
Okay, so I will exercise my privilege and power with asking the first question. You've kind of outlined kind of the positive case for the value of the story, but there's also people who have kind of look at it from a less positive point of view. Mm-hmm. Like there's a lot of people some people out there who hear voices from God, and that God asked me to do something really weird, And is it kind of, I think some people have the fear about this story, like if somebody came along and said to you that God told me to kill my son, would you feel good about it? Like, is it, that this is one of the criticisms, I think, that it's a dangerous story, because it might put silly ideas into the minds of silly people. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I have heard of instances where people claim they've had a word from God about all sorts of things, and often it seems to be very questionable what they're told to do, or inconsistent with ethics that we've received from elsewhere from God. I get your point that, well, this would fit that category, wouldn't it? Yeah, okay.
When you test these, like if you know that it's God or if it's actually Satan saying more, you know. It's a bit like we heard of boys, but one of them, you know, just kind of.
Yeah, I've heard someone give an explanation of that, which I thought was a good one. Firstly, you have a feel about it, whether it feels right or not, and you pray about it and see if there's any word comes to you. But there might have been one or two others, but the last one was you test it against the Bible, because if you look at the Bible and that is inconsistent with what you think you're being told, then you know it's not from God, which raises the question about this story.
Not killed.
Abraham didn't have a Bible.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
That's right. No law, no Bible.
I would.
Yeah, but that's not the case.
Even there's the command in
to Noah.
Back to Cain, really, isn't it? Or,
and to Cain. Yeah, that's the thing. You say, oh yeah, well the laws weren't made till Moses' time, and in a sense, that's true. It was actually all codified at Moses' time, but all that substance of it really existed from the year dot. You know, I pointed that out about animal sacrifices. I pointed that out about clean and unclean animals, but there's a lot of other things you can look at too. For example, the thing that you should not kill people. That what didn't begin in the law of Moses. It actually goes right back to the time of Cain and Abel, when Cain did kill his brother Abel, and it's just the implication is there already that he knew he shouldn't have done that, and he's guilty because he did it. So the law, in that sense, that you shall not kill, goes right back to the very beginning, and so do a lot of other things. You know, you shall love the Lord your God, and you shall love your neighbour as yourself. They've been there from the year dot, and they're embedded into people's consciences everywhere.
Yeah, there was no death in this story.
So again?
There was no death in this story.
In the Genesis 22 story?
Yeah.
Yeah, but nonetheless, Abraham, I get the point Kevin's saying, that he was told to go and kill his son Isaac. Now, if I was told that, I would think, oh, that's just inconsistent with everything I know of God. Well, why didn't Abraham think that? Yeah, I can't answer that.
Well, that's done this talk for the night, hasn't it?
Can I throw a suggestion? Well, it was from God in that case. We know that because that's what it says. But the other thing is, God does things in strange ways that we don't fully fathom. And sometimes He seems to do things for a long-term purpose. And here, there doesn't have an obvious long-term purpose. And this is a magnificent illustration of what was to come. So we can benefit, all mankind can benefit from what happened then. Yeah. And maybe that's what God was thinking. And it's a very strange thing for Him to tell Abraham to do, but when you look at it from our perspective, there's a benefit.
It's a lesson there for us today to just have the faith in God that He will look after. And
also the parallels with Jesus that came later. You can look at it and see, it all makes sense now when you look at that story and in Jesus being put on the cross.
Presumably it was absolutely clear to Abraham that this word was from God. You know, where it's only told very briefly there at the beginning that God said this to Abraham, and then Abraham complied. It must have. It doesn't spell out how that came to Abraham, but he must have been convinced. God must have convinced him that this was His word to Abraham.
Well, he had seen many remarkable encounters with God before, hadn't he? So
he had.
Yeah.
I don't think it has answered the question you're really trying to say, isn't it? That unbalanced people or the copycat killings.
They have certainty too, don't they?
Yeah. So that's what you mean by being dangerous, that an unbalanced person who's not rationally going to check his Bible to see that what he's about to do is okay. It's a form of justification for doing it. Is that what you're saying? And there are people clearly who hear voices in their head as well. Is that what you're trying to imply by the question or not?
Yeah.
Well, for the unbalanced people, obviously, at the end of this story, as Paul pointed out, God said, "Don't kill him," and so even if this was God's voice, God's word all the way through is "Don't kill."
Yeah, but
analysis.
But then that person might be expecting him, as he took his, AK-47 or what it was, that he was going to be told before he pulled the trigger not to do it.
And if we did pull the trigger,
well, that's right. Yeah, he told me so. Yeah, so
but there's all manner of deranged people, and some people are going to use this as an excuse to say you're against religion generally. Particularly the Christian religion.
It's not just crazy people, because there is kind of a pressure on within some circles within churches that the high point of spirituality is if God spoke to you.
Yes, correct.
So people might feel pressure to say, "Oh, God told me this," or "God told me that."
And it might not be to kill somebody. You're saying too.
No,
it can be something else that might be slightly off or slightly that you might be doing.
then it comes back to what Rick said.
I was sort of just not quite what this is about, but I watched a lot of documentaries, and I watched the documentary where this thing hit me just between the eyes. Or read it. It was on YouTube, like in some of these scientists talk about. And they said that it was up until about 3,000 years ago, people had no idea that the thoughts that come into their mind were coming from within their mind. They assumed it came from, if they heard a noise, like a sound which there's nothing around, which a lot of people do, a word said to them or something like that this is actually outside of their bodies and coming into their mind. If they had suddenly realised something like that, they would see that they were enlightened from something or other, avoiding God, but that's basically what it means, from outside. And so then I thought, well, when we were in Sunday school, we wondered whether all these Old Testament characters actually heard a voice, a physical voice as such. But the idea was that they had no idea about the subconscious mind or the operation of their brain or anything like that. They just, and if something seemed as though it just popped in there, it was from outside. And so Abraham and Moses and all those, maybe that's what's going to.
How do you know they didn't know how their minds worked?
I'm not sure how they knew.
They're very old people.
No, it's a good question.
Yeah.
You're saying they don't know. Well, how do you know? How can you be so confident they had no idea how their minds worked?
Well, I don't know, because they didn't say how they know. But sometimes when I hear people, scientific people like this say things, they don't always tell you exactly how it happened, because it just takes too long. It's time to get it through. But my guess would be is that we know when we first found out, when we began to understand that voices don't come from outside, but they come from within ourselves. And that was way less than that time ago. Okay. But maybe it's something like that.
I'm a bit sceptical about anything that implies that we know so much today and they didn't know much back then. They're all primitives and everything. I just don't think life's like that. Sure, there's technological advances and everything, and there are cultural differences and everything. But do you know, has any scientist been able to explain what consciousness is? They can't. No scientist today can truly explain what consciousness is.
No, but they work on it. The difference between
they might work on it.
Is one is sort of they just take it for granted. I hear a voice that's come from without. But the other one is they rely on evidence. That's why science seems to say that they know these things, and other people see it as pure arrogance. but it's based on evidence. So it's a difference between faith
But
and
it's someone's
evidence.
interpretation.
No,
of
that's,
evidence.
Exactly. Interpretation.
I don't think
Fair point.
I don't think that science has even got a good explanation of how we think. So we still can't answer the question, where do our thoughts come from?
Well, there was a time when we couldn't explain why the planet Jupiter or something seemed to go backwards in the sky. There's a bit of a loop in the sky. We couldn't explain it. Now we can. And then all these things have experienced.
Yeah, that might be true of the planets, but I don't think it's true of the mind.
No, but you know what I'm saying. You must know that there's progress takes place in science, bit after bit, as they learn more and more. Now, we know an awful lot more about the human mind now than we ever did, but how it originated. And for death, for example, this is what interests me in another documentary. This fellow was walking down the street and he said, some of the most amazing thing in the whole known universe is happening in this street. And so you're listening, and he says, people are waking up from sleep. He said they are coming back to life, that they've actually died. When you're sleeping, you have a dream, and you're in your own dream, but it's a modified form of yourself in your brain, modified form. Between your dreams, you know nothing. You have no consciousness whatsoever, no feelings, nothing. And that's when apparently there's a brainwave that goes through the whole of the brain all together, so that all those individual brain waves are now removed. And this major thing goes through. I don't think they actually understand why that happens. But it does, anything that is connected with our consciousness and all that sort of thing would be removed by that brainwave. And that's why we don't see it. They don't have any consciousness. In fact, we don't have any existence at that time. Ourself, what we mean by ourself. But as we wake up, that not miraculously, but that comes back again into the brain functioning again, and we come into consciousness. Because it's the patterns in the brain that produces it. But no, they don't know the whole story.
It's fascinating.
It is fascinating.
We're somewhat off the track, I think.
Yes, we are. We're off the track. We could go on this. Well, thanks for that red herring.
So Isaac was conscious the whole time, I take it?
But there is a saying, when man stopped believing in God, first of all he lost his soul, then he lost his mind, then he lost consciousness.
That's a good saying.
From the point of view that if you take a purely naturalistic view of the human brain, say that we're just a brain without a mind, then you lose belief in the mind, you only believe in the brain. He's lost his soul, because first of all, people used to believe that we were a body with a soul. So in materialism, you chuck out the soul, then you chuck out the mind, and just say that we're a brain. And now you have atheistic writers saying, denying the fact of consciousness. Like Daniel Dennett is what it means, who denies consciousness.
And Descartes to an extent as well.
I'm not sure about that. All right, sorry. All right, now better go back on the topic.
I still have never been able to get over the thinking of Abraham at that time, given his supposed understanding of God and the things you pointed out about sacrifice, human sacrifice and killing of people being abhorrent to God from way back, why Abraham would think that God would tell him to kill his own son.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't answer that. I can only think that it must have been clear to Abraham that it was from God. It's funny too that Sarah's not involved in this. I mean, Isaac's the son of Sarah, he's the son of Abraham. And Abraham gets up early in the morning and ticks off. Presumably Sarah's still asleep, wakes up and finds, well, Abraham's disappeared with Isaac and away.
I'd never get away with that.
Well, I got the impression Abraham told everyone that Isaac and I are going off to sacrifice to God, took some servants with him for that purpose.
Yeah.
So I assume that's what he would have told his wife.
Yeah. I guess so.
Would he have told his wife he's going to kill
No,
the
the
boy?
servants
No.
would have found out. in the morning.
Going off to do a sacrifice.
Yeah, he wouldn't tell his wife I'm off to sacrifice.
He didn't tell anybody until he was about to go Isaac.
He might have made it out the door.
I guess God can be persuasive.
Yeah, there's lots of questions around the story that we could conjecture about, but
Well,
we're just not told, are we?
Abraham had grown up in the Ur of Chaldees. That's
Mhm.
what, he left and God told him to. And maybe that society had been into the habit of sacrificing their children to their gods. I don't know.
They may have been,
is
I
that a
don't
fair
know. That
question?
they were, they believed to be moon worshippers back there, and that was fairly pervasive through that part of the Middle East, then and later as well. I don't know whether they had child sacrifice or not.
I don't know if
human sacrifice.
you saw it in the books. I should have maybe done some homework, but I can remember, I think it was in Bible stories, reading about various major leaders, kings, if you want to use the term, who built cities. And so built the city of such and such at the cost of his first son or his second son.
Well,
and I've always imagined that these kids were killed and put into the foundations, which is how they found them in South America sometimes. They were built into...
I've not heard of that. The only thing that sounds like that is in relation to Jericho, when the ancient city of Jericho fell, when the walls came tumbling down, that story, it was said then that would remain a ruin, and whoever built that would be at the cost of their, doesn't it say there, the cost of their son or something? That's the only thing that I can think of in the Bible that relates to what you're saying.
That was not a sacrifice, that was just something that happened.
That was a curse. It was like a curse on whoever rebuilds this place that's supposed to be desolate forever.
Yeah.
It'll be at a big cost. But Jericho was rebuilt. I've actually been to Jericho. Supposed to be the oldest, not continuously ever, but the oldest city in the world. So
I thought that was
Damascus is
Syria,
the oldest.
Damascus, yeah.
Damascus is the oldest continuously inhabited city, I believe.
Because Jericho had a break.
Yeah. Oh, it might have had more than one break.
What were you saying? Jericho is the oldest city.
They did have
got
some.
some
They had
I
some
think
story.
it's hard to prove it anyway.
Yeah,
One way or the others.
There's ruins there. There's ruins on ruins on ruins in Jericho. It's all pretty messy.
I would suggest that possibly Sonley Urfa, also known as Odessa at one stage, would probably have a better claim to that than Jericho.
Oh, okay. I remember being there, and they did tell me some.
Every place claims they've got
they had some
something.
claim.
Right.
There's some pretty ancient ruins there.
They're old.
Well, it's even Isaac submitting to be, like in the picture there, to be tied up, that's so he's actually taking part in submitting as well.
That's right.
Because he could easily, in anybody's eyes, outrun his father,
Yeah, I think all that's implied in the story. It's not told specifically, but he must have been compliant. So.
You mentioned in passing the story of Jephthah, and he told his daughter something like, you've made my life a mess, now I'm coming in. Well, it would have to be you to come out of the door, now I've got to kill you. And she's asked for permission to have a short respite, a few weeks or something.
2 months.
Yeah.
2 months, to go to the mountains and mourn with her friends before she had to come back and face the music.
Bewail her virginity.
Bewail her virginity. But, it's very clear in that story, it's not clear whether he actually cut her throat, but it is very clear that she complied, agreed,
Yeah, well, she said that he had to carry out his vow, and it would be wrong for him not to.
And she had the freedom, but she did return, knowing she was going to be killed.
Oh, you're saying there's the same compliance there on
same
her
compliance.
part. Yeah,
so that's really spelled out in that story,
Yeah.
even though it's not really clear if he actually, cut her throat.
It's a pretty terrible
I
story.
reread that story 2 nights ago.
It's a little bit similar to even Noah's sons really submitting. My father heard, build a boat, and they spent 200 years building a boat. Well, I tell you what, that's a jolly lot of faith.
Yeah.
To get behind your father and say, well, in the middle of the desert, wherever, let's build a boat and let's keep on for another 200 years.
Yes.
Let's cut the timber, let's grow the trees, and submit to your father if he's heard from God. That's a lot of faith,
There's nothing so much fun as messing about in boats, though.
You know what I'm saying? If your father said, let's build a boat.
Yeah, I guess. Still a big boat. Yeah.
With Jephthah's daughter, I have done a bit of a study on that one because that one's long bothered me too. And the general conclusion is that most likely she was dedicated as a servant at the tabernacle for the rest of her life, never to marry. So Geoffrey would have lost his daughter in that sense to serve at the tabernacle and would never have had any grandchildren.
Where did you get that from?
There's no proof of that. I can't remember the details where it came from, but that's just the general conclusion that came.
Are there Jewish traditions about that?
Yeah, it's
non-biblical tradition, rabbinic
Yeah,
traditions,
it's a
yeah,
rabbinic
which may or may not be
May or may not be
reliable.
true, but the way it was put, my vague recollections, it was believable.
The story sounds like she was sacrificed in the Bible
Yeah, it
account,
does.
but it just seems
Well, it's
dreadful.
not saying that Geoffrey did a good thing, though, is it?
No.
It's just that he made a foolish vow, but having made it, he felt compelled to keep it.
Just occurs to me, I've always thought that the law about the firstborn, you could redeem the firstborn with an animal. Remember, the firstborn...
You could, you must. You must redeem. Yeah, firstborn and a human. Firstborn human must be redeemed. Firstborn animal was...
was it only the boys that were supposed to be redeemed, or was it the firstborn girl was that...
The firstborn girl was never in that position to need to be redeemed.
Never firstborn? Because maybe would that apply to Jephthah's daughter?
If it applied to the male, it would apply to the female in that context, if that was how it was going to be done.
I'm
So
pretty
she
sure
would
it was
have
all
already
with
been-
males. It was to do with males.
I thought it was to do with males.
Yeah, that was specifically to do with males because it was the male that had to be sacrificed to God, the firstborn male. So therefore, it was the firstborn male, therefore the human had to be redeemed. The firstborn female was never in that position to be offered to God in the first place.
So maybe this vow
be
made
necessary.
put her in that position of having to be offered to God and then redeemable, which adds weight to your what you were saying before, Geoff, about
it's conjecture,
she got out of it. She's got out of it alive.
The Passover in Egypt was the death of all the firstborn males in Egypt. From the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the maid who grounded the millstones, made the flour or whatever. So it was a male-dominated society. That's for
Anyway,
sure.
the story of Jephthah and his daughter is really sad.
Yes.
It is. It really is. The whole story, the whole book of Judges is there for a point. There's a cycle in Judges of Israel falling into gross evil ways, idolatry and forsaking God, God giving them over to some horrible enemy who dominates them and oppresses them and grinds them down and does everything, and then crying out in their woe-begotten state to God, please help us. And God sends a saviour, a judge, to rescue them. And this happens over and over. So they're brought out of that and they return to worshipping God. Then they fall away again. And there's this pattern all through Judges like that.
Like a sawtooth, isn't it?
Yeah, and Jephthah himself is one. And often the characters in it, even though they're judges, they're raised up by God for deliverance. They're not very savoury characters.
Yeah.
Like Samson in particular, a pretty unsavoury kind of character. And Jephthah himself, it says he was the son of a prostitute. Not that says anything about Jephthah, but it's a pretty unsavoury kind of background. And
he killed a few people too.
And I think because of his origins, the townspeople, his half brothers and that, all pushed him out and mistreated him, and then in their extremity, they looked to him to save them. That's the background of that story. So the whole book of Judges, many people criticise it. They say, how come that's in the Bible? So many dreadful stories in it. But it's there for a point. And one of the things that it's there for too is to show that it's God who provides leadership, and it was his intention finally for Israel to be a kingdom, for there actually to be, although the kings later were up and down as well, but God intended that there to be a king too. There needed to be leadership in the country, and it was not right that everybody just could run around and do whatever they wanted to do. Which is, Judges says that several times. There's no king in Israel. Everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes. And that's sort of kind of a refrain as well through Judges. Sorry, that's a bit of a digression.
It is.
Interesting.
Anything else that people would like to ask or make a point about what Geoff spoke on?
Silence was the loud reply.
Silence
was the loud reply.
All right, okay, good. All right, thank you very much. Next meeting, Steve White will speak on Eusebius. Now, some people may not even know who Eusebius was. Eusebius is the major source for writing the history of the early church. He was...
after New Testament times.
Yeah, after New Testament times. So he was around in the Bishop of Caesarea, and he was basically an advisor to Emperor Constantine I, who legalised Christianity, and he wrote ecclesiastical history. And so he just provides references to a lot of sources and quotes from sources that we no longer have. So he's kind of the sole source for what a lot of writers had said, and reconstructing the history of that period between around about 70 AD right up to around about 313 AD. And he also wrote, he was advised to Constantine, he wrote the life of Constantine as well. And so that's a major source. So he's terribly critical for a lot of our knowledge of what happened, but he's also been the subject of various accusations about how he handled the truth. So hopefully Steve will go into all these topics. So it should be quite interesting.